Hey, we're back. Welcome back to the Half Naked Quilter. We're going through the materials and equipment and supplies that you need to get started being a quilter. We just did all of the tools. And again, some of those you don't need to get now. They're asterisked on the list so you can tell. Now what we're going to talk about is equipment. First thing you need is an iron and an ironing board. Now, honestly, if you've already got an iron and an ironing board, you'll be fine for now. You'll see I've got a fancy schmancy one because I probably make about 30 quilts a year. So I have a fancy one that has a giant tank and a hose and the whole 9 yards. Don't spend your money on that right now, right? As long as you've got an iron and an ironing board, you'll be fine, right? So whichever one you've got now is completely fine, the one you use for your clothes. That's what I did for years. Second thing you'll need, is a sewing machine. Now, I have a big, can you see this? That's my Bernina back there. I bought it 15 years ago. It's computerized and will do everything, including making dinner. Frankly, I use almost nothing of what it can do except straight stitch and zigzag, right? So I spent all this money and frankly, I don't use most of what that thing can do. All you need is a sewing machine that will do a straight stitch. That's all you need. It's that simple. Now with that machine, there are two presser feet that you're gonna make sure you've got. The first one is a 1/4 foot. In the quilting world, all of our seam allowances are 1/4 inch. Oddly enough, this is actually true if you're in like Canada. I have a friend of mine who's a trainer for one of the big sewing machine companies in Canada. And I said, do y'all do millimeters or something? He's like, no, we do 1/4 inch. So all of our seam allowances are 1/4 inch. In the garment world, it's either a 1/2 inch or 5/8. In the quilt world, it's all 1/4. And it makes it a lot easier if your presser foot, which I just dropped, is a 1/4 inch wide, right? Because then you're just guiding along the edge of the presser foot, you got your 1/4 inch seam. Now, if you can't get a 1/4 inch foot, you can put a piece of tape, a guide piece of tape down that's a 1/4 inch from the needle, and you'll be fine, right? The most important thing is that all of your seam allowances are the same, they're all consistent. But if you've got this 1/4 inch foot, it just makes the process a little bit easier. This one's got a little guide bar on one side. I have another one that doesn't. So a 1/4 inch foot. Something you will need, again, at the end of the process, when you're putting the binding on, is a walking foot. Now, if you've seen the working area of your sewing machine, there's a set of little gripper thingies that are pulling the fabric forward every stitch. They're pulling the bottom fabric, and the top kind of goes on along for the ride. But if you're going through 5 or 6 levels of fabric or there's batting, that sandwich is really thick, what'll happen is it'll pull the bottom along and the top will drag on the underside of the presser foot, and it'll cause a bubble and a ripple and it won't line up, right? What a walking foot does is it's got a thing on the top that follows those set of grippers and guides it through as a sandwich. And it makes the process of putting the binding on so much easier. Now, if you can't get a walking foot for your machine, you can do this without a walking foot, and we'll talk about how to get around that. It's just easier with the walking foot. Here's the walking foot for my machine. It's got, I don't know if you can see that little yellow, this little yellow thing here. As the needle goes up and down, this little thing follows along and runs it all through. This one's kind of a pain to put onto the machine as well, but it works really well. So you'll need a walking foot. You don't need it right now. Okay, we did that. Okay, last two things are your working tables. Now you're gonna want two. You're gonna want a table that your sewing machine sits on that's at sitting height, right? I have a special cabinet that's all fancy and shit, right? But any table that's at a comfortable seated height will work just fine. The second thing you'll want is what we call the cutting table, and that's where you'll do most of the non-sewing work. It's where your cutting mat lives. It's where you do all of your cutting, right? For me, this is a standing height table. In fact, mine's custom made because I'm 6'3" and the normal ones are a little too low. My back starts to hurt. If you have a problem standing long periods, get yourself a table that works, seated in a chair. You can. It's entirely up to you. The important thing here is you have two separate tables. Now, the reason why is because there are points in this process where we're going back and forth between the cutting table and the sewing machine, the cutting table and sewing machine. Sometimes it's cutting table, sewing machine, ironing board, cutting table, sewing machine, ironing board, right? But you want it to be two separate tables so that you're not having to move stuff out of the way, do some positioning and cutting, bring the sewing machine back. That's just super awkward, right? So it's two separate tables. All right, so that is all of the equipment. Is that thing still working? Ha! Bachelor's degree in computer science, and I can't run my own phone. All right, it's working. All right, so that's the equipment you need, right? Last thing we're gonna talk about is supplies. Supplies are things that you run out of and have to get more of sometimes. That's why I've got them in a separate category. Part of extending the life of your sewing machine is regular cleaning. And you'll see when we sit down at the sewing machine for the first time, 3 or 4 episodes into this process, the first thing I do when I start a new project is I clean and oil my sewing machine. Super easy to do. I change the needle, It's just get into the rhythm of that, because taking care of your machine and getting the lint out of it and keeping it oiled per the manufacturer's specifications will extend the life of the machine. It will also extend the time between when you have to take it in for service, which can be kind of spendy, right? So the first thing you want to get, and I always have to get this at the hardware store, I can never find it at a fabric store, canned air. So it comes like this. There's normally a little straw taped to the side of it that goes into here. And all this is it's literally air, right? We're going to use this to blow lint out of the bobbin case before we get started the first time. For some reason, cotton fabrics throw a lot of lint, and you need to blow it out of there because it will eventually gum up your machine. I've actually seen times where I've been sewing along and I've been lazy and I haven't cleaned it, and I'll hear this thunk, and the machine has tacked a wad of lint to the back of whatever I'm sewing, right? So get yourself a can of canned air. Sewing machine needles. There are 50 million different kinds of sewing machine needles. I have a lot of them because I do lots of different kinds of sewing. What we use, our workhorse in the quilting world, and there's 2 different ways to talk about the size of a needle. So you'll see a number slash and another number. It's basically the metric one versus the imperial one. You want 80/12 size needles. That is the workhorse. Here we go. They come in a package like this. I call them size 12. If I was in Canada, I'd probably call them 80s, right? 80/12 needles. Now, the preferred kind of needle, because they make these in different types, are what's called sharps. And sharps are cool because, like the name implies, they are super sharp, and which means they're really accurate when they go into the fabric, and you get really, really accurate stitches. So the preferred one are 80/12 sharps. What I use, during the lockdown, I was doing a lot of sewing, and I couldn't get 80/12 sharps in bulk, and so I use what's called universals. Universals are a needle that's designed to kind of be the workhorse for everybody, and it'll do a lot of different things. I buy them by the 100, right? Because I go through them really fast. So either sharps or universals. In the quilting world, we go through a lot of thread. And if you've only got 1 or 2 bobbins for your machine, you're gonna be stopping and winding bobbins every 30 seconds. It is incredibly annoying, right? So get yourself at least a half a dozen extra bobbins for your machine. And every manufacturer uses a different kind of bobbin. These are the ones for the Bernina, right? We're gonna pre-wind them before we get started so that when you run out of a bobbin thread, you can just pop open the case, pull out the old one, snap in the new one, you're off and running. And it's a really fast process. So you definitely want extra bobbins. So I've got a stack of these things. You want at least a half dozen because we're gonna wind them at the start so we don't have to deal with this later on. So extra bobbins for your machine. Your machine probably came with a little thingy of oil. Make sure you know where that is. Because at the beginning of a project, when we do the cleaning and maintenance work, part of what we're gonna do is we're gonna oil the bobbin case per your manufacturer's specifications. That little drop of oil makes a huge difference. Towards the end of a project, my machine starts to rattle, and this is a really expensive machine, but it starts to rattle. Oil in it, no problem. It's amazing the difference that makes. It also saves wear and tear. right? Because for every stitch, there's a thing inside that bobbin case that goes all the way around. So you can imagine how many stitches you're doing. There's a lot of friction there. So making sure that we keep it oiled will extend the life of your machine. Let's talk about thread. Most of the time, the thread's not going to show. So you can do nearly all of your quilt piecing, and again, putting the binding on is a separate deal, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. You can do nearly all of your piecing with one of two colors of thread, basically a warm tone and a cool tone. So this is what this silver gray, this is my workhorse because I have a tendency to work in cool tone fabrics, and it just disappears. What color number these are, this is the Coates & Clark, which is the cheap shit. What color number this is on the sheet, right? So this is the silver gray. This is the Ecru, it's just a pale off-white. This is Gutermann, which is one of the higher end companies. It was on sale, which is why I bought it. And you see this, just that pale off-white. And again, the color numbers are on the sheet. Which one you use will depend on kind of what color family that you're in. If you're working with mostly cool tone fabrics, things that have a blue cast to them, you're gonna wanna use the silver gray. If you're working with things that are warmer toned, golds and browns and that sort of thing, then you're gonna wanna work with the off-white. Honestly, once you make that decision, you'll never see the thread the rest of the time. So you don't have to buy 60 million colors of thread. Get yourself 3 or 4 spools of each one of these so that you've got them handy. If you start a project, it's like, oh, I'm using colors I don't normally use before. My workhorse is a silver gray, but I've done things in these warm tones before and gone, oh, that's right, I've got a spool of that in the drawer, right? There's one thing, actually it's not on my version of the list, but it'll be on yours. Before we go buy 70 million yards of fabric and spend 70 or 80 bucks, right? We're gonna work with practice fabric. We're gonna learn how to do the basic piecing and cutting with fabric that's cheap and that we don't care about, right? So you're gonna wanna get a yard each, and it doesn't matter what it is. A yard each of a light color and a dark color. Now I pulled these from my fabric stash. If you get into the quilting world, you're gonna discover that you collect fabric. We all do. I swore I wouldn't, and that lasted 3 months. But we're gonna get some practice fabric, and this can be the cheap stuff, right? This happens to be a really high-end solid from a company called Kaufman. It's called their Kona solids line. This is a really, really high-end fabric. This is a batik that I pulled out of my stash. I love batiks, so I have a lot of them. So I just pulled a batik out of my stash. But you want a yard each of these practice fabrics. Don't worry about pre-washing them. We're not gonna worry about that now. We'll talk about pre-washing down the road here. But this will give you a chance to practice things without using fabric that costs you a whole lot of money or that you have to worry about, right? We'll do things on the practice fabric, and then when we're ready, we'll talk about the fabric you need to get for the first project. That's it. That's everything you need to get started. So what you're gonna do now is go gather up the supplies and the equipment and everything else. And when you come back, we're gonna start talking about how to work at a cutting table. I'm looking forward to getting started. Go away, get your stuff, set up your space, come on back, and we will start cutting fabric.